In 1177, the mathematics looked final. 26,000 professional soldiers against only 500 knights with perhaps 3,000 foot soldiers behind them. A ratio of more than 50 to 1. On paper, it was not a battle. It was a liquidation. The kind of campaign historians usually summarize with a few cold verbs: invade, overrun, disperse, collapse. And yet, on a dusty field near Montgizar, one of the most powerful rulers of the Eastern Mediterranean rode into what should have been an easy triumph and came out of it stripped of certainty, stripped of prestige, and nearly stripped of his life. That is why this story matters. Not because it is merely improbable, but because it reveals how empires and kingdoms often break long before they formally fall. They begin to end when arrogance replaces discipline, when one side mistakes weakness for helplessness, and when a dying man proves that will, under the right conditions, can move faster than numbers. The transcript you provided frames this as the story of two men, and that is exactly right. Not because armies stop mattering, but because armies often behave in the image of the men commanding them. On one side stood Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, the great unifier of Egypt and Syria, a ruler whose star was rising across the Islamic world, a statesman and commander who had forged an empire from the Nile to the Tigris, and now looked south and west toward the one remaining insult he believed history still owed him. On the other side stood Baldwin, the fourth king of Jerusalem, 16 years old, crowned too early, dying too soon, and marked by a disease that should have made him a ceremonial figure waiting quietly for the grave. Instead, he became the most dangerous kind of opponent, a man who understood he had no time and therefore wasted none. Oh, see why Montgizard became possible. We have to begin with Saladin at the height of confidence. By 1177, he was not yet the near-mythic conqueror popular memory would later build, but he was already the dominant political and military force in the region. He had united Egypt and Syria under one authority. He had outmaneuvered rivals, consolidated power, and given the Muslim world a center of gravity it had lacked for too long. To him, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was not simply another frontier state. It was a wound, a foreign Christian kingdom planted in the Levant by earlier crusading violence, a lingering affront, a splinter in the body of the region that had survived longer than, in his view, it had any right to survive. He did not see Jerusalem merely as territory. He saw it as legitimacy, as unfinished business, as something that must eventually be erased if his larger project of restoration was to feel complete. That matters because it helps explain the emotional force behind the campaign. Saladin was not marching only for practical advantage. He was marching with conviction. Conviction sharpens men, but it can also tempt them into reading situations less as they are, and more as they wish them to be. The campaign of 1177 offered exactly that temptation. The intelligence looked perfect. The Christian kingdom appeared weak at every level. King Amalric had died. The throne had passed to a boy, and not merely a boy, but a sick one. Baldwin IV was only 16. More damaging still, he was a leper. In an age that understood little of disease, but much of visible decay, leprosy made him politically and psychologically vulnerable in ways that went beyond bodily suffering. It did not just attack the flesh, it invited contempt. It told enemies that time was already killing the king for them. It told opportunists at court that succession was the real battlefield, and that the current monarch was a transitional inconvenience. The transcript emphasizes that Baldwin could not feel his right hand, that his body was already being steadily stripped of sensation and strength. Whether every detail belongs to this exact moment, or to the broader known progression of his illness, the larger truth stands. Saladin and many around him looked at Baldwin and saw not a long-term threat, but a dissolving obstacle. They saw a kingdom led by a child who should not rule and a body that should not fight. They were wrong, but they were wrong in a very human way. They mistook visible fragility for strategic passivity. That mistake would echo through every later stage of the duel between them. So the invasion began. The transcript gives 26,000 men, elite Mamluks light cavalry infantry drawn from Egypt and Syria, the largest war machine the Holy Land had seen in a generation. The route itself tells us how confident Saladin felt. He ignored the border fortresses. He bypassed Gaza. He did not waste time chewing through every wall because he believed the kingdom's center was already vulnerable enough to justify a direct thrust. He headed for Ascalon, the last major bastion before the open road to Jerusalem. The logic was ruthless and sound if the defenders were truly weak. Why grind yourself down on peripheral strongpoints when the political heart lies exposed? Why let the enemy define the pace with sieges when fear and speed might do the work for you? Saladin's movement had the quality of a man who believes he is no longer advancing into uncertainty, but executing an already won campaign. That is a critical distinction. A commander still engaged with uncertainty preserves cohesion. A commander who believes the outcome is settled begins unconsciously spending the discipline that brought him there in the first place. Back in the kingdom, Baldwin faced the kind of counsel every doomed state produces. Men who count walls, provisions, and odds, then advise caution until caution becomes surrender by another name. It would have been reasonable, perhaps even rational, to stay behind fortifications preserve what little strength remained and wait for the invader to break himself against stone. But reason depends on timing, and timing was exactly what Baldwin understood better than those around him. A kingdom that only reacts to Saladin's larger numbers, greater manpower, and deeper resources is a kingdom already moving toward death. It may survive a siege. It will not survive the pattern that follows. Baldwin did something that horrified his advisors because it sounded like madness. He gathered the only force he could assemble quickly. 500 knights, perhaps 3,000 foot soldiers, and rode south. That number matters not only because it was tiny compared to 26,000, but because it reveals what kind of decision this was. He was not marching with false hopes of matching Saladin line for line. He was not marching because he thought a normal field battle was favorable. He was marching because he understood that if he did not act before Saladin's army settled into the interior and shaped the campaign on its own terms, the kingdom's strategic options would evaporate one by one. until only ritual defeat remained. The immediate result seemed disastrous. Baldwin reached Ascalon and found himself effectively pinned. He had too few men to withstand the full force of a siege by 26,000. Saladin arrived, took stock of the situation, and made the choice that should have ended the war in his favor. He left a detachment to watch Ascalon, then continued with the bulk of his army toward Jerusalem. Why wait? Why become trapped before a fortress when the holy city itself stood exposed? Here the transcript is blunt. This was the greatest mistake of Saladin's life, a mistake born of arrogance. That is strong language, but strategically the point is sound. The mistake was not simply dividing his force. Division alone can be prudent. The mistake was the mental state that accompanied the division. So sure was he that victory was complete, so sure that Baldwin was trapped and neutered, that he loosened the discipline of the army. He allowed plunder. He allowed units to spread out. He let a campaign army turn into a moving cloud of opportunism. Villages around Ramla were opened to looting. Soldiers loaded themselves with booty. Communication frayed. Sub-commanders acted with the laziness of men who believe the only work left is collection. And that is how a superior army begins to die, not first by enemy steel, but by the internal evaporation of focus. Inside, Ascalon Baldwin watched. This is one of the most important moments in the whole story because it reveals the kind of king he actually was. He did not merely endure pressure, he observed it. He saw Saladin's main force moving away, saw the dust cloud divide, saw the gap no one else believed could matter. His barons begged him to remain behind the walls. Better to die in a fortress, they argued, than be massacred in open ground. That is the language of men who think only in terms of survival percentages. Baldwin was already thinking operationally. A detachment left to contain a besieged force is dangerous only if it is alert, disciplined, and large enough to react quickly. If it is too small and too confident, it becomes a plug that can be broken. Baldwin's scouts found exactly that, a breach. The detachment watching Ascalon was underprepared for an eruption from within, because its purpose in the minds of those who left it, there was not to fight, but merely to contain. This is what arrogance does to tactical detail. It turns active threats into administrative assumptions. Baldwin gave the order. The gates of Ascalon would not open for surrender. They would open for attack. That single decision transformed the emotional geometry of the campaign. Saladin believed himself to be the hunter. Suddenly, the prey was moving. On November 25th at dawn, the gates burst open and 500 knights rode out into the desert light. The detachment left behind to watch the city did not even have time to form properly. It was overrun and destroyed before it could send warning. This is essential. Had even a small number escaped with clear news, the entire later sequence might have collapsed. But Baldwin's opening move succeeded not only because it was bold, but because it was fast and absolute. He did not trickle out. He did not test. He erupted. And once through, he did something even more audacious. He did not ride toward Jerusalem to defend it. He rode north, following the trail of destruction left by Saladin's dispersed army. He turned defense into pursuit. The symbolic inversion is almost shocking. A dying king with a tiny force was not retreating to preserve sacred ground. He was hunting the largest army in the region. At the head of that impossible column rode Baldwin himself. The transcript emphasizes the image, and rightly so. He was 16 years old. He could barely hold the reins with his left hand. His right hand, numbed by leprosy, was bandaged. His face was hidden by a silver mask that concealed lesions and weakness, yet his presence mattered more than his bodily capacity. Kings in pre-modern warfare do not function merely as commanders issuing technical orders. They are mobile centers of meaning. Their bodies communicate. Their willingness to share danger tells subordinates what kind of emotional reality the army should inhabit. Baldwin knew that. So did his men. They brought with them the kingdom's most sacred relic, a fragment of the true cross, the wood on which they believed Christ had died. That changed the charge from military maneuver into eschatological theater. Men ride differently when they believe they are carrying not only their own survival, but a sign that heaven itself is watching. In a modern analysis, one can call this morale, cohesion, symbolic capital. In their world, it was simpler and more dangerous. They believed they were riding either to death or to miracle. Meanwhile, Saladin's army had become exactly what Baldwin needed it to become. The transcript says it clearly: the 26,000 men were no longer an army. They were a chaotic camp. Units were spread across miles. Soldiers were plundering Ramla. Horses were grazing. Weapons were stacked. Communication between commanders had thinned almost to nothing. Saladin himself was near Montgisar, relaxed enough that he did not even set up proper defenses. This detail is damning because it reveals how far confidence had drifted from prudence. The tactical genius of later memory had not vanished. He had simply inhaled too deeply from the intoxicant of apparent victory. The child king was trapped. The leper was irrelevant. What threat could he pose? That is the fatal question in war. Not because there are no weak enemies, but because deciding too early that weakness equals incapacity blinds you to the one thing all weak opponents still retain: the ability to exploit your own slackness. Baldwin's scouts found the main camp and returned with the kind of report that commanders dream of and distrust at the same time. They were disorganized, loaded with plunder, horses grazing, blind to his presence. The opportunity was real, but tiny. Baldwin had to decide in an instant. He could wait, he could harass, he could attempt to draw Saladin into a more measured encounter. But all of those options favored time, and time favored only the larger army's recovery. Once Saladin realized the deception and pulled his men back into coherence, the kingdom's brief opening would close forever. Baldwin understood that this was not a normal tactical choice between aggression and caution. It was a question of exploiting a singular crack before it sealed. He looked at his 500 knights at the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Barons, and veterans who knew exactly what he was asking. He was asking them to charge a man they had every reason to fear. He was asking them to hit the center of a numerically superior force, not nibble at edges. He was asking them to substitute shock faith and speed for all the things they did not possess in adequate quantity. So Baldwin dismounted, knelt in the sand before the true cross, and prayed for victory or a glorious death. The scene matters not because it proves divine intervention, but because it reveals how leadership becomes contagious under pressure. His men watched a king whose body was already betraying him choose action over self-preservation. That kind of spectacle is operationally useful because it resolves hesitation. A commander does not always need to explain everything if his own posture makes retreat feel morally impossible. When Baldwin rose and gave the order, the army no longer had to decide whether the plan was madness. Their king had already accepted that possibility. Now they only had to execute. It was the afternoon of November 25th. The sun had begun to lower. The 500 knights lowered visors, straightened lances, and began to move. First a walk, then a trot, then a gallop. This acceleration is worth dwelling on because cavalry shock depends not only on speed, but on compressed intent. A charge that gathers itself over distance becomes a single political statement in motion. That is what Saladin's camp heard before it fully saw. A thunder on the horizon, not the sound of a large army maneuvering, but something denser, harder, more concentrated. Then the riders emerged through dust and sunlight. The setting sun flashed off helmets and armor. Panic began before impact. Men were on foot. Weapons were not in hand. Commanders shouted contradictory orders. Saladin's personal guard, the Mamluks, tried desperately to form a line. But a line assembled seconds before collision is not a defensive system. It is an instinctive arrangement of bodies hoping geometry will save them. Baldwin did not strike the flanks.
Let it be done.
He struck the center. That choice matters enormously. A lesser commander might have tried to nibble at weak edges, preserve the possibility of disengagement, or chase isolated pockets. Baldwin understood that only one thing could make 26,000 men collapse quickly enough for his smaller force to survive a blow to the heart. So he drove directly at Saladin's personal guard at the command corps at the symbolic center of certainty. The transcript calls it a 100-pound steel hammer striking glass, and the image is apt. The Mamluk line broke. Infantry dissolved. The knights cut through the camp with concentrated violence. Notice what the source says next. There was no tactic. That is true and untrue at once. There was no elaborate tactical sequence after impact, because the essential tactic had already done its work. Surprise concentration. Shock at the center and timing had transformed the enemy from a coherent army into a field of local panics. After that, violence itself became the operative method. Saladin's soldiers loaded with booty scrambled for weapons, horses, and units that no longer existed as functioning formations. Terror spread faster than orders could. This is where commanders either impose themselves on chaos or are consumed by it. Saladin, the conqueror of Egypt, the unifier of the Muslim world, watched his own guard die around him. The transcript describes paralysis, not in the sense of cowardice, but in the sense of cognitive rupture. He had seen battle. He had seen armies break. But this was not how the day was supposed to develop. He was not facing a relieving force of equal size or a prepared trap in terrain designed against him. He was facing 500 knights driven by a king he had already mentally discounted. And at the center of the charge rode that king beneath the sign of the true cross, a silver-masked figure who looked less like a sick child than like a theological challenge in armor. Saladin's men did not see simply a tactical threat. Many would have seen something uncanny, the symbol they had intended to erase, now advancing as an instrument of judgment. In pre-modern battle, what men think they are seeing can matter almost as much as what is physically there.
Hold fast! Signal the rear!
The Mamluk bodyguards tried to buy time with their bodies. They created the last barrier between Saladin and collapse. But barriers made of men can hold only if the men behind them still believe the structure around them exists. Here, it did not. The center was already torn. Panic had become a contagion. Soldiers thrown into flight spread flight more effectively than any herald could spread command. Saladin grasped the reality quickly enough. Capture would be worse than death. A dead sultan can become a martyr. A captured one becomes the ruin of his own legitimacy. So he ordered retreat. But there is a difference between ordered retreat and survival instinct. What followed was not the first. He mounted his fastest racing camel and fled with only a handful of his closest guards. That detail from the transcript is devastating. Not because flight itself is always dishonorable. Many great commanders survive by escaping doomed situations, but because so many of his men saw it. The psychological effect is obvious. If the invincible sultan flees, then the fiction of recoverable order disappears with him. An army may survive severe losses if it thinks command remains intact. It does not survive well once it sees the center tearing itself free from the body. At that instant, the battle became what the transcript rightly calls a human hunt. The 500 knights were no longer trying to defeat a formed army. They were driving a general collapse. Baldwin's 3,000-foot soldiers arrived behind them not to rescue a precarious cavalry charge, but to intensify extermination. Men fleeing loaded themselves into disaster. Some were trampled, some drowned in streams. Some died trying to find horses that had already bolted. Some were cut down while clutching plunder. They had moments earlier mistaken for victory. This is why the question, how can 500 kill 26,000, must be answered carefully. They do not kill 26,000 directly in the mechanical sense. They create the conditions under which the larger force destroys itself through panic, fragmentation, and pursuit. That is what decisive shock does when it hits a force already hollowed out by arrogance. It does not simply reduce numbers. It rewrites the emotional logic of the field faster than the bigger army can resist. The scale of the result shocked the world. The transcript claims that of the 26,000 men who entered the kingdom, fewer than 3,000 made it back to Egypt. Whether taken literally or as the narrative memory of catastrophic annihilation, the intended meaning is unmistakable. Montgizard was not a narrow tactical success. It was a strategic humiliation. Saladin barely escaped. His reputation for invincibility cracked. It would take years to rebuild both the army and the political aura that had just been punctured. The kingdom of Jerusalem, which had looked one step from collapse, had purchased time in the most expensive currency available. blood applied at exactly the right instant. And Baldwin, the 16-year-old leper king, who was supposed to fade quietly, while older, healthier men managed around him, rode back not as a survivor, but as something far more dangerous to the politics of the region. A legend.
We return not as survivors, but as a force reborn. At the head of this living army.
That is where
claim
I'll
our
stop
destiny.
part 1. Because the next movement of the story is not just the aftermath of Montgizar, but the duel it created. In part 2, I'll continue directly into Saladin's humiliation in Cairo, Baldwin's cold understanding that he had not ended the war, the strategic gamble at Jacob's Ford and Chastelet in 1179, Saladin's revenge, the disaster around Marj Ayun, the fall of the fortress, and the beginning of the slow internal rot that turned Baldwin's miracle kingdom into a state living on borrowed time.